Tonight we're going to be talking weird Wisconsin with a old friend of mine, Paz, from the Timeline Earth podcast. Paz, introduce yourself.
Yeah, for anyone in the audience who's not familiar with me or my whole deal, my name is pseudonymously online Dexter De La Paz. I am one of the members of the Timeline Earth crew, formerly the Friends Against Government, a podcast that's been going strong for, 5-ish years now. And it was spawned after a meeting of some anons in one of your previous Twitter group chats.
That is correct. I used to go by the screen name Anarchy Ball, and that's where I was introduced to you guys because I was furiously adding you guys to my group chat because you are hilarious. So,
Hey, can I derail your entire show for like just 2 minutes?
absolutely.
I was given explicit instructions after talking to one of my co hosts earlier today that I was supposed to ask why you're going by Headless Giant now. What's
Oh,
going on with that?
very, very interesting. So basically, I decided, kind of like the Timeline Earth boys, that it's time to get away from libertarianism because it's a sinking ship. So, for the most part, I still hold the political beliefs, but if we're going to get serious about this, it has to be a spiritual issue. And for me, I found a lot of spiritual connection looking back at Greek mythology. So I turned even into even more of a dork, if that's possible.
Very good. I was just very curious myself. No offense to you. And in fact, this may even be praise, but you've had a lot of imitators over the years too, even among people who can't match your really one of a kind energy. So I was a little hesitant at first because I didn't know if it was really you or not. And then it became very quickly obvious. And I jumped at this opportunity to come talk to you.
Thank you
But it,
so
it
much.
caught
That's
me
high
off guard
praise.
because I hadn't heard about the Headless Giant pivot.
Right. So basically, it kind of occurred to me that, in terms of body politic, right? If you look at how things work, it's almost an anarchist statement. The spirit of mankind can really go and do anything without this authority over top of them. And that's sort of a religious statement as well. And so the empire is always trying to screw its head onto this headless giant that can go and do whatever it wants without them. So when you have that context, it kind of makes sense.
Yeah, and it makes a lot more sense now. So thank you for indulging me. We can get back to the actual topic now. But I
Absolutely.
just had to know, but that's perfect.
So tonight I wanted to talk about some of the weird, wild, and wonderful things about Wisconsin and all of the strange goings on. So let's start with like a heat map overview of like some of the hot spots that you know of when it comes to paranormal activity, cryptid activity, and these things. This is your specialty.
Yes, and it has been since I started podcasting. I'm a little bit of a politics dork, but my first passion has always been conspiracy theory, cryptids, overnight radio. I cut my teeth and still have that specialty. My Twitter bio is the true heir of Art Bell, so this stuff's extremely my jam. It always has been. And being in and from Wisconsin, it's really the perfect place for this because what people don't realize is every state in the Union will at one point or another claim to be the most haunted or claim to have the most concentration of supernatural phenomena. But Wisconsin is one of the few states that can actually justifiably wear that title. We are right up there with places like New Jersey and California in density of UFO sightings. We are the dogman epicenter of the country, along
Right.
with Louisiana, of all places. On top of that, we have a high concentration of Indian mounds. And as if all of that weren't enough, we also can claim some of our nation's most prolific serial killers.
Absolutely, and we can get into the whole clown killer himself a little bit later on. But let's start with some cryptids, right? So The cryptid that I think Wisconsin is best known for is the Beast of Bray Road. Let's get into that a little bit.
An absolute classic, my personal favorite. Oh wow, did you just hear that on your recording? Someone just ripped shit down the street outside my apartment.
Perfectly fine. I live in the middle of Black River Falls. I'm hearing it all the time down here anyway, so it's all part of
So,
the milieu.
yes. Um, the Beast of Bray Road is an infamous dog man in the not quite Kenosha County area. It's the southeast corner of the state in that sort of odd, strange channel of urban fill that exists between Milwaukee and Chicago that all of a sudden turns into some of the most beautiful farms you'll ever see as soon as you get off the interstate and out of that urban fill. And it was popularized in the 90s after a local newspaper started reporting on sightings. And then as people began researching it more and more, as happens with these phenomena, as more sightings and stories came out, including deeper into the past, and people began to realize that the same thing, the same being, had been appearing since the 1920s.
Right.
There was a major uptick from the late aughts through the early 2010s, and sightings are kind of dying back off now. But the nature of these phenomena, especially cryptids, are that they tend to be cyclical anyways. So it's not that it's going away, it's that it's hibernating in either a literal or a figurative sense. But yeah, it's brought the dogman craze to the forefront of the country. That's when everyone else everywhere else started talking about their own sightings only after the Beast of Bray Road rose to its prominence.
Right, and we see a big uptick in places like Kentucky, where they're all about the Dogman now, and they even have like conferences and stuff about the Dogman in Kentucky. But it's like, this is where it started. What are you guys doing in Kentucky?
It's total, absolute cryptid stolen valor. And I haven't really had the chance to talk Dogman with anyone super recently. So to really get into it a little bit, a theory that I've had for a lot of years now, and I kind of want to bounce off you as the learned man that you are. We all, of course, know the story of the Rougarou, the French werewolf, and that goes back to the late Renaissance, early modern period.
How do you spell that?
For some cases. What a lot of people don't realize is that the legends of that creature followed the French to the New World, and that there's also a high concentration of both werewolf and dogman reports in Canada, in Maine, and then into Wisconsin, following the Mississippi River down, and that's why you also see such a high density in Louisiana. And so it's been a theory of mine for a long time that there may be some connection between the phenomena of the werewolf specifically, or in our case, the dogman, and French settlement patterns beyond just a cultural myth. What do you think of that?
That's very interesting. So there's something about, because yeah, there is a French connection, right? Yeah, I mean even the movie American Werewolf in Paris and whatnot. You're talking about something there, but it's not necessarily. It's just so weird, you know. It's so strange that these myths would have such a link because, as you know, in Wisconsin, we're talking about. Well, at least out here in the sticks, they've got every other street is called coulee, and coulee is just the French word for road, and those roads go back to the 1700s, and so yeah, there is definitely a French connection. I didn't really even think about that.
Mm-hmm.
The thing I
And so to play up that French connection a little bit more, I'm willing to dox this info on your show and to you because I'm not afraid of shit. But I'm down in Prairie du Chien, and I spend a lot of time not living in, but around and in La Crosse growing up. So I'm all about that French connection. I've got no French heritage myself, but to your point, Mormon Coulee Road, the main street of La Crosse, or one of the main streets, that connection is everywhere. And when you start realizing that these towns, which are considered quote unquote big for us guys living in nowhere in western Wisconsin. Those are our big cities, and they're built along these, in American terms, ancient connections and travel ways.
Absolutely. So that's another interesting thing is that in at least the Kentucky sightings, they all seem to be centered around bodies of water. So, like between bodies of water, you'll find this beast coming out, and in Wisconsin, it's far more centric around the roads. It seems.
Uh, so in Wisconsin, here for us at least, it is, you are correct, primarily predicated on two things: roads, and when you get into older accounts and find historical references, the Indian mounds that are so prevalent up here.
Mm. Yeah, let's get
So,
into that a little bit because these are unique Indian mounds. They are effigy mounds. That seems to be the dominant form of them. And I've seen some websites claiming that Wisconsin has more mounds than any other state, but I haven't really seen that play out. What I have seen is that there are a lot of effigy mounds around the Mississippi River.
that's right, including Cahokia down the river by St. Louis, which is the mound city. Not even as a title to brag about, but just literally what it is. It's an entire city of these structures and burial mounds. And what that connection is, I don't pretend to be a Native American scholar. I've got some friends among the tribes, the Ho Chunk, that are more local to us, but it's not really that deep, or at least they haven't shared it with me. As we know, many of the Native American tribes were either forcibly resettled or naturally migratory, and the actual mound builder cultures are not the same ones that were there when white settlers arrived in these places, at least not typically. And so you take into all those things into account. You're right in that they are effigy mounds. Where I live, right on the banks of the Mississippi, not 15 minutes across the river into Iowa, is literally Effigy Mounds Park.
Mm.
And it's got some of the best preserved and largest of the actual effigy mounds around, excluding the truly massive ones like, what's the name of it in Ohio? Serpent Mound?
Serpent Mound, yes.
So it's a larger complex, but the mounds themselves are much smaller than, say, that, for example. And so what we know about what they were built is like a lot of scholarly pursuits, specifically scholarly pursuits about history. We don't actually know, and anyone who tells you they do is just feeding you a line of hooey.
Right, and what we do know, I've been to the Trempolo Mounds, and Trempolo is a little town just south of Winona, and the mounds up there are actually up on top of a hill. So like the hills is pretty close to a cliffside, and they had to really build it up to get to the top of this hill, and then they build a mound on top of the hill. So there's lots of different styles and ways that they built these things. And after excavating them and finding, lots of arrowheads and stuff like that, they're like, well, this has got to be a burial mound. I don't think so, and I think even the early founding fathers who actually went out there and surveyed all of the mound sites pretty much in North America, I don't think they thought that they were just burial mounds either.
So Jefferson, in particular, if I'm recalling correctly, was pretty notorious for being a mound excavator on top of everything else, wasn't he?
Yes, he was. He did that. George Washington did that. Basically, all of the Society of the Cincinnati were heavily engaged in documenting and finding all of the mounds in North America. And the Society of Cincinnati, it's like the super masons, right? So every president that ever gets elected is now inducted into the society, and basically that's been the military junta that's been in charge of the country since 1783. And those are the guys, right? So to take over a nation, you have to think about it like it's a sports team, right? So you got to control the clock, you got to control the personnel, right? You got to have a good coaching staff, and then basically from those two perspectives, you can start working it in. the Society of the Cincinnati is like the personnel office that ran the country. So they just kept drawing from the military and drawing from all these different pursuits. And there was only one founding father that ever spoke out against it, which was Dennis Burke. But that's sort of a side tangent, uh, but very heavily related because I think the people engaged in that society knew exactly what they were doing when they were mapping out these mounds. We don't, even today.
And to that point, I'm going to get on one of my favorite bugaboos that really has no information but is also extremely connected. I mentioned Jefferson very intentionally because of the connection to Lewis and Clark.
Right.
And there's the whole deal about Meriwether Lewis. I think you see where I'm going with this, right?
You are correct. So the Lewis and Clark expedition were the ones coming out this direction, but there have been a lot of conflicting stories that came out of the Lewis and Clark expedition that people still don't make sense of today. And they saw a lot of interesting stuff. I believe, wasn't there a Bigfoot sighting on the Lewis and Clark expedition?
Alleged. I've never had the opportunity to actually read the journals or reprints or articles of research about them. I will get to that at some point in my life, but there's just so many projects and never enough time. But, the thing I always find interesting, though, is why were Lewis's journals disappeared after his murder?
Right.
Which, some people still insist was a suicide when I think it's pretty clear that he was murdered.
Yeah, and there's definite parallels between that and Captain Cook, right? So Captain Cook, was it Cook? Who was the guy who went to the South Pole? It was not Cook.
Gosh, it was one of those explorers.
Yeah, the Operation High Jump, where...
Byrd.
Byrd, there you go,
Byrd.
Right, so Admiral Byrd goes to the South Pole. He dies mysteriously. His son ends up with all of his papers, and then he's found dead in a warehouse, and they find his papers, and then you've got this strange account of aliens and whatnot in the South Pole, So there's definitely a parallel, maybe not an intersection, but, the scarlet thread is there, right?
Yes, that's exactly right. And so you get into connections like that, and at a certain point, what do you even do with it?
Right.
I mean, there's obviously something there, but the amount of time and effort and money it takes to unravel something like that, especially when it's something that people in positions of influence don't actually want unraveled. And all that's a massive tangent. We've already split off from our main topic into several sub-branches now.
We've got into UFOs now. We're totally on the UFO kick. So let's talk about the UFO sightings in Wisconsin.
Yeah, so as I mentioned, we are actually one of the top 2-3 states per density and frequency of UFO sightings, including historically. Throughout the 40s, 50s, and 60s, when UFOs were really becoming a thing, they were a fairly regular occurrence here. And they still are to this day, with Madison, of all places, being a hotspot for them. And some people might chalk that up to just population density, but then that would not account for the lack of them in Milwaukee or La Crosse or Green Bay or any of these other larger settlements that are here in our state.
I would be one of the ones that would chalk it up to that because I'm a truck driver, so I make rounds out to these little small places out in the boonies. And let me tell you, talking with the owners of small establishments out in the middle of nowhere about UFOs is very enlightening. Very enlightening. I've talked to them and they're like, yeah, I see them every night, right? So between, let's see here, between Neilsville, right, and I believe it's Osseo. Between Neilsville and Osseo, there are establishments I have talked to people there, and they say that they see orb-like UFOs every night as they're taking their dogs out for the final time. And that's interesting to me because they're not reporting it. In Madison, it's a tourist attraction. Out here, they just want it to stop. You know?
Yeah, it's a fact of life that no one's actually comfortable with.
Right. Right. But if you see all the reporting, if you were going to put a heat map of weird Wisconsin occurrences, it would all be focused around Madison, Milwaukee, and the spaces between over there. But those are just the people reporting it. And the people out in
And
the
that is, of
country.
course, the other big thing about this, right? You have to account for unreported reports. If Wisconsin's already top three and stuff that does get reported, how much goes unreported? And that's
Exactly.
why I feel so strongly that Wisconsin has such a genuine claim to the veil being genuinely weaker here for whatever reason.
You can see it in the skies. Like I've noticed, I've lived a lot of different places, and the skies in Wisconsin are some of the most crystal clear and perfect skies I've ever seen. Like you could see those fluffy little cumulus clouds for hundreds of miles. Once it gets that little layer, you know what I'm talking about. You get this little layer
Mm-hmm.
of puffball clouds that will just stretch out for miles. That's if they're not, putting down the layers of chemtrails on top of the skies. Once you have the clear skies, you can just see these little perfect puffball clouds for hundreds and hundreds of miles. And I think that's an indicator of the nature of the land itself is that it's got it's got very, very clear exits, right? And speaking of exits, let's talk a little bit more about some of the military activity. Like, for instance, in Neilsville, the guy talked to me about how it's a training site. So they've got a test site where they will drop bombs, like not real bombs, just like dummy bombs. And so we've got these fighter pilots doing sorties. Like I don't even know where the base is. It doesn't make any sense. Like they're not coming from any of the big known bases. So is there a tunnel system that the government has built around Wisconsin?
A person almost has to wonder too. I know that McCoy, and here in our, well, roughly the stretch between you and I, McCoy,
Right.
is a prolific staging ground and a huge rally point, departure point from the Midwest. But, there's all sorts of other little bases tucked all around the area. So you do kind of have to wonder, right? And at the point that you're using it publicly as a logistics hub for the region, at what point is there something underneath it?
Right. Well, especially with McCoy, because McCoy, I was deployed out of McCoy. And the big thing that, I didn't think about immediately, but they had a bunch of historical plaques talking about how that was used as a concentration camp for the Japanese during the Japanese internment during World War II. So they shipped them out of California and brought them to Wisconsin. And so, to me, that's interesting because it's like, why wouldn't you just put them in concentration camps in Florida? There's lots of different places out there. But I think that was an exercise. And so they've still got on Fort McCoy a bunch of existing buildings from that time period falling apart and rotting on that specific site. So, the military activity in this area is sketchy at best.
And once you get over into the other side of the state, of course, you also have, things like military vehicle manufacturing centers. And
Oshkosh,
that's
yeah.
why you're always seeing convoys of Humvees and shit when you live up here. It's because they're getting rolled off the assembly line and put on trains or taken to bases from here.
Absolutely, yeah. It's highly militarily active in Wisconsin. Every small town has a Black Hawk. No, not a Black Hawk. What is it? It's a Huey helicopter from Vietnam era, mounted onto a plaque that is sort of like out in front of the veterans VFW halls, right? And so what they'll do is they'll take all this old military hardware, they'll strip it down, and then put them up outside of all these small towns. So like you can tell the grade or how many veterans have served in those small towns based off of the military equipment they have mounted out in front of their VFW halls.
Yeah, like almost like trophies.
Yeah.
For instance, my hometown where I was born lived my early years, Viroqua, they've got a tank sitting out by the VFW.
Yeah, it's really strange. It's not like that anywhere else in the country that I've seen, but it's almost like, what they're doing is they're reminding everybody what their purpose is out here. We grow them big in Wisconsin, right? We got big men out here. And so what they like to do is whenever they've got a war, they come knocking on Wisconsinite doors.
Yeah, the upper Midwest and the Appalachians are two of the most fertile breeding grounds for the warriors that make up the American Empire's core troops.
Right.
It's not all us. You do have to give credit to the descendants of the borderers who settled the mountains, but we are certainly right up there too. People talk about corn-fed Midwestern boys and farm strength, and those are both very real concepts.
Right. I found out the other day why they call it the Badger State. It's not because we have badgers, right?
Oh, no.
They call it the Badger State because the miners and the original inhabitants would dig holes in the side of the driftless and just live inside there. They were making their own tunnels,
Yeah, you were either a French trader or you were a German Norse miner.
Right. And they just dug out the side of the hills, and we've got really soft sandstone out here, like especially in this region in western Wisconsin. They've got sand mines everywhere, and what they do is they break up these basically big old mounds of sandstone, and then they ship it out on trains to go to the fracking places. Unfortunately, that sort of died off since fracking causes earthquakes.
Well, they claim it causes earthquakes at any rate.
My parents live in Oklahoma City, and they got like a 4.0 earthquake. And they're like, well, they just kind of stopped fracking after the third or fourth earthquake. It's like, well, something to it.
So you're saying there might actually be something to that, then?
Right.
I've always kind of been skeptical of that claim because it's such a productive means of gathering energy. I just assumed that the earthquake was like black propaganda against it, but I'm willing to take your word for it if there's really something to it.
It's all regional. I think it all depends on the amount of stable stone that you have in that region. And what they do is they frack, which is basically injecting water down into these cracks in the earth, and then all of the gas comes up, and there's a void left. So they use all the sand from Wisconsin to just dump into these holes to keep it stable. But that wasn't working in the Arbuckle Mountain region, which is where close to Oklahoma City, and so the Arbuckle Mountains are some of the oldest mountains in the world, like almost as old as the Appalachians. And what's funny is, the Appalachian mountain range goes around in a circle and comes down to the top of England and Scotland. So, the people who came from Scotland and Ireland and settled in America actually settled in the same Appalachian mountain range that they came from, which is really strange. It's like they've left the highlands of Scotland and then they come over to the highlands of America, which is the same mountain range connected across the Atlantic over to where their home was.
I'm not super into that whole epigenetics and blood memory thing, but it's that sort of stuff that makes you wonder about it, doesn't it?
Absolutely. And if you look at the farmers who settled out in Wisconsin, they came from the lowlands. And what do we see in the Driftless? Almost nobody is up on the side of these mountains. Like they don't build their houses up there. They settle in the lowlands.
No, the people who move up onto the bluffs are yuppie retirees from the Twin Cities or
Right.
Chicago or Madison with more money than sense.
Right. It's strange. It's all that epigenetic memory, at least a little bit. You can almost see it in the land itself. And so, the farmers stick to the farming land, and then the, yuppies, they go up to the mountains. You see that in Colorado. You see it all over the place, It's crazy. So what other strange sightings or activities did you have for us?
Gosh, well, we're just running through this stuff so fast because we were so excited to finally have this discussion and talk about it. We did Dogman. We did UFOs. We did
We haven't done ghosts.
mounds. What was that?
We haven't done ghosts.
Ghosts, yes, the actual paranormal. Um, Man, I wish I could say that there's some really cool stuff right here where we're at, but most of the stuff that I'm familiar with as far as that goes is actually from back when I was living in Kenosha on the other side of the state. I spent a good decade there from approximately fall of 2013 to the spring of 2021. Uh, After everything that happened there, no need to go into that any further. But there were some really good ghost stories from over that way. And Kenosha, I would say, due to probably its proximity to Lake Michigan, is just an insanely haunted city. You know, you've got your really typical stuff, lady in white, ghost hitchhikers. You've got the classic, oh, that used to be a boarding school and now it's haunted by dead students and teachers. You've got the lady who haunts the railroad tracks out there. You've got, and this one's real good, there is a graveyard in Kenosha. It's the oldest one in Kenosha, and it contains the grave of the only man ever executed by the state of Wisconsin. He was hanged, cleared and made declared innocent after his death, and we had such a distaste for it after the fact that we do not have capital punishment here now.
Wow.
And rest assured, he does haunt that graveyard, and he not just haunts it, but he is actively malevolent.
That would be too.
One of my largest impediments to ghost hunting myself is I have a very poorly honed sixth sense. I'm not the type of guy who's ever seen a ghost. I don't think I ever will see a ghost myself with my own eyes. But I have a lot of friends, probably due to the nature of my interests, who claim to have an active sixth sense. And even without them feeding each other stories, you know, I have interviewed them individually in controlled conditions. Not a single one of them's been able to go into that graveyard without just an overwhelming sense of actual evil being there. And I don't know a single one of them that's got the courage to go in there overnight with me. I've made the trip myself, and while it's a naturally creepy place, of course it's spooky, but it goes beyond just that for people with that sort of sensitivity.
Absolutely, yeah. There's a place up in Chippewa Falls. It's an old bar, and they've got a picture of a maiden on the front of the bar. And I looked it up, and there's some ghost activity there that is associated with this woman that they basically turned into their, I guess, mascot, right? And so the mascot for the bar is the ghost that haunts it, right? So they've got a little bit of that touristy spirit to it, but it's very much different from, you know, all of the, like, if you check out the ghost sightings on any of the different Shadowlands and stuff like that, it's all centered around Madison. It's all between Madison and up there. But I think that it's just they're not doing their due diligence out in western Wisconsin. We've got a lot of weird stuff happening out here.
Oh yeah, it is simultaneously, while the sun is out and shining, the most peaceful, pleasant place I've ever lived. And, you know, that probably is just a response to having lived here. But even among places I've visited, it's just peaceful.
Right.
But after the sun goes down around here, man, the ghosts and the goblins, they come out in a hurry.
Absolutely. Well, on a kind of related topic, what about Bigfoot sightings? Are there any major Bigfoot hotspots out here in Wisconsin?
I wish I could tell you that there were, but Bigfoot is actually one of the things we are sorely lacking around here.
Really?
You'll get stuff here and there, but we don't have a whole lot of it.
See, it's so strange because all I see on these rural roads is these people buy these Bigfoot silhouettes. Have you seen those?
Oh, they're all over the place.
Everywhere. Yeah. And it's like, these people are dying for Bigfoot. Where is the Squatch? Come on, Squatch, you are welcome in Wisconsin.
I think if a person wanted to go fishing for those in particular, the place you'd have to look is the Northwoods, right? Up on the border of Lake Superior, right at the top of the state.
Right. And speaking of Lake Superior, we would be doing the people a disservice without talking about the water panther that they have up in Lake Superior. So the water panther is a really interesting cryptid, and it goes back to pre-Columbian times too. They have petroglyphs of the water panther on big old rocks right in front of Lake Superior. And a lot of people who have lived up there have said that they can see it on really, really stormy nights. Like it comes out of the water and swims around when it's the least hospitable. It's almost like a weather spirit.
And see, that's one I'm not even familiar with. So if you could tell me anything more about it, I'd be interested to hear more.
So the water panther is kind of like a bluish black. It's they're not sure if it's actually a cat, but it's from the profile, it looks like a cat, almost like um, the Black Panther sightings that you hear about in places like England. But what's different about it is it's always associated with Lake Superior or the upper reaches of Lake Michigan. So this water panther is so people will be walking out on like these promenades that they have at the parks close to the lake, to oversee the lake, and on really stormy nights, really, Lake Superior is one of the deadliest lakes in the world. So the storms up there are no joke. A lot of people have died in the storms on Lake Superior, and when it gets massive surf out there, there will be at least one or two boats that capsize. It's trying to move through the Great Lakes. So this water panther is seen on nights that it is the most stormy and active up there. And so it's just one of the strange things. Now, the Native Americans believed that this water panther, you had to leave gifts for it because it was extremely ill-tempered. So they would be leaving gifts for it on the shores of the lake once the weather turned bad. Sort of like, please stop. You're harassing us. Please stop. But in a lot of ways, it reminds me of the Thunderbird. It's very closely associated with strong weather or powerful incidents.
Yeah, and I tend to believe that there's got to be at least a little something to a lot of those weather spirit or nature cryptid sort of reports, those sort of totemic elements, not just here in Wisconsin, but throughout this country. There's just so many of them.
Right. There's some sort of a nature spirit idea going on here, but I think that it's so far outside the norm. People have a hard time, getting into the idea that something could be above, the land itself. It's like you hear about demons that are rulers over something. I think that's sort of like a more modern interpretation of what's going on with these totemic spirits, right? So you'll have that all over Europe. So, for instance, like the Seine River. So in France, they've got the Seine River, and there is a goddess of the Seine River. And a lot of places in America are actually named after the goddess of the Seine River, which is interesting because, it's like it's almost forgotten in Paris at least, and forgotten over here, but we still got the name floating around, which is strange.
Yeah, and part of that is very clearly the Christianizing influence that's so deeply rooted throughout Europe, even if they have abandoned it in the most recent centuries. And I think that one of the virtues of America, and probably to our benefit for discussing these things, is that we are such a young nation, and the peoples that came before us here were so old in their own right that those things are still embedded in the land itself. And it's going to be a long time yet before they start to go away, especially given the inability to assert a cultural hegemonic dominance here.
Right. So the original name of the water panther is the, let me see here, it's the Mishipeshu, Mishipeshu, right? And the Mishipeshu is just a weird, fascinating creature, and it's associated with the Ojibwa, which, as you know, the Ojibwa is one of the prominent tribes in this area. So
Absolutely.
might be
And
interesting to go talk with them about some of these things. That could be a project, you know. Go out to the Ojibwa territory, go out to the Ho-Chunk, and ask them about some of these ancient myths, because I think the ancient myths are coming back in a big way. If we look at what's going on around us now, and you're talking about the thin veil, this is going to be one of those hot spots for that kind of activity.
I really couldn't agree more. And a uh, synchronicity blogger that I hold a lot of respect for, Chris Knowles, had this idea of repaganization. And he's got this theory or this inkling or this opinion that a lot of it is coming from or due to cults of Mithras, that are still so embedded in the control and command structures of our culture and society, obviously on the down low. But given that that started out as a Roman soldier's cult in an attempted repaganization of Rome after Christianity asserted itself, and the obvious Rome LARP that the founding fathers were so intent on, uh, there's an interesting thread to tug on there and possible connections buried within it.
Absolutely. So, one of the threads there, you're talking about the Mithras worship, right? And the Mithras worship, I've actually been getting more into that because it's all sort of like pegged around the Eleusinian mystery schools. And the Eleusinian mystery schools of Greece ended up becoming the Mithras worship in Rome. And one of the ways that I know that is this book right here. I talk about it all the time. The Golden Ass by Apellius. I don't know if you've heard of this book, but it is fantastic. If you haven't read it, I highly recommend it. It's about a guy who transforms himself into a donkey in ancient Rome. So this was written at about 170 AD, right? So this is a very, very old book. This is one of the last surviving books from or novels from the Roman period. And so this book was preserved and reprinted in the 1500s, where they gave it its new name, the Golden Ass. But originally, it was called Metamorphosis. And so at the very end of this book, the main character, Lucius, he becomes a initiate into the Eleusinian mystery schools. So after being an ass, he then becomes an ass, right? So no, but he actually becomes a lawyer, so he does become an ass, right? So it's really interesting. It's got vampires in it. It's got this strange sort of cultish group of bandits that worship Mars, right? He doesn't call it Ares; he calls it Mars, you know. And so what he's doing in this book is sort of creating a sort of an allegory, or kind of like a narrative alchemy, right? And so as he's walking you through all of these stories, he's actually bringing you into the initiation, and you don't really know it until the end when he finally says, yes, I'm being initiated by the goddess has saved me. And the great goddess for all of the initiates is Queen Isis, right? And so he makes that reference in 170 AD. And so this is like one of the fundamental literatures for Hermeticism to come later. And so all the people who are saying, oh no, Hermeticism was a Middle Ages thing, they haven't read The Golden Ass, because The Golden Ass lays it all out right there in black and white, that Hermeticism was a very, very old thing, very connected to the Eleusinian mystery schools.
And yeah, it was ancient even in the time of Rome already.
Absolutely, which kind of brings us back to the, the Dogman. Is the Dogman related to Anubis? Is it a psychopomp?
It very well could be. And what makes that even more interesting, especially in the case of the Dog Man, is the accounts from the early church fathers of Christianity about dog-headed men.
Mm, yeah, I've seen that.
And you hear those accounts, and they're often dismissed as, oh, well, that's just what they were calling barbarians of a certain tribe, and that was just a put down. It was clearly an insult to show that he was ministering to foreigners. Well, I don't like all of that because it's just pseudo intellectual dismissals.
It's garbage.
I want to believe. I just want to believe. What if the Dog Man is older than we even know?
Well, again, it could be permutations off of the Dogman, because like the thing I found in my research is that the ancients viewed the gods as shapeshifters, and you even get that in the Bible a little bit, right? That these gods can take the form of many different things within their realm of control. So the Dogman idea, really goes back to Hecate, right? So Hecate is sort of like the goddess of magic in Anatolia, right? And so she is in charge of these dogs, and so she's often depicted as a three-headed goddess, and she's associated with these three-headed dogs, right? And so what we see guarding the underworld is the three-headed dog. And the one thing we know about Greece is that they are obsessed with Egyptian mythology, right? So a lot of their gods and goddesses and their goddess structure all dates to Egypt in some shape or form. So it's and then we see philosophers sort of realizing the potential of Egypt, going down there, initiating into their secret practices, and then coming back. A lot like Pythagoras, right? So Pythagoras was said to go down to Egypt, get initiated, and bring all that knowledge back with him. And, then we're talking about the foundation of mathematics there. And a lot of other great philosophers are said to go down to Egypt, get their initiation, spend like 20 years down there, and then come back. And then the later theurgists talked about how you're not really a philosopher unless you spend 40 years studying mathematics. Could you imagine the philosophers we've had since actually going through the work of studying mathematics for 40 years? I think they shouldn't call themselves philosophers because that actually meant something.
Yeah, well, you talk about things like that, and then you do start to wonder, because even normies and even non-believers, I'm not sure that's an appropriate term, but people less inclined to woo, let's phrase it like that, still have this idea of mathematics being the fundamental language of the universe.
Right.
When you take that in its very secular form, they're typically talking about physics and the observable underpinnings of creation. Well, it sure seems then like the ancients were already onto that too, doesn't it?
Right. And what a lot of people don't understand when it comes to this stuff is that a lot of it was ecstatic, oracular revelations that brought about their sciences, their holy sciences, their objective sciences. So it was people tripping out on either extreme meditation practices or they were really, really high on drugs, coming up with concepts like ontology. And so, all of the stuff that we consider to be, the basis for science came from people who were having oracular revelations, And so, if you think about it today, maybe a lot of the science that we see is the result of ecstatic states and different forms of consciousness that they're just not willing to talk about because it's frowned upon by the midwit scientific community.
The establishment, as it were.
Right. So there's no place for magic anymore, even though we all know that's sort of where our understandings of the world came from originally. So that doesn't really bode well for our society if you think about it, because we've basically kicked the foundations out and we're just sort of floating down the river, patting ourselves on the back.
Yeah, and I very intentionally The way I present on a show like this is not just a front. I genuinely believe in the mystical. And even if I didn't believe in the mystical, I still think it would be important to allow space for the mystical in your life.
Absolutely.
You know, at the point that you allow yourself to become soulless and enraptured in the assumptions of materialist paradigms, you lose a lot of what it is to be human.
Right. There has to be some element of the unknown, and unfortunately, the more we get into the scientific materialism, the less of the unknown we get, which is crazy. You know, like how are you guys claiming you know all of this stuff when you can't even really describe it very well? And any see, the way I put it like this is, politicians have always had questions that they couldn't answer, right? They just refused to. Now there are just more of them. And so if we're going with that paradigm of, we know everything, well, look at our leaders. Like, they're supposed to be the pinnacle of understanding at this point, and they're just not. So maybe we can assume that because they don't know anything, that they're not getting good information from our scientific establishment. And I think there's a big crossover there. Once we can start following some of these threads back, we'll find that a lot of what we know as settled science is just hokum, you know? And we get that
Well,
indications.
and that leads me to another one of my very favorite topics, the Giants and the Smithsonian cover up, right?
Oh, here we go. Yeah.
Uh, not that there's, well, in brief, right? We were talking about mound excavations, and what a lot of people don't realize is it wasn't just the well-to-do who had a hobby for this in the New World. It was gentlemen farmers and country lawyers and rural doctors who would do this in their spare time at mounds that were once prevalent on private land across the country. And then, all of a sudden, the Smithsonian is founded in the 1840s. And by the 1890s, things that had been submitted to them for research or gifted to the Smithsonian are disappearing left and right. And all of a sudden, a immigrant, I believe he was technically from Bohemia, but he was a Czech-Slovak, comes to America, ends up as the head of the Smithsonian, and decides, nope, this doesn't agree with the brand new at the time theory of evolution. It's clearly fake. We never received these things, despite what my own organization's reports said before I took over. It's all gone. It's all fake.
Right. Now it's funny, the 1840s is such a tumultuous time in the United States, and it gets very little play. Like, everybody wants to talk about the Civil War, but when it comes to the 1840s, they're all pretty much silent. And the institution of the Mormons came out of the 1840s. The Millerites, which nobody talks about anymore, go figure. And then you've also got the Smithsonian. So basically, this was another time of sort of reset. This was when they were sort of planning out the history that they wanted to teach people for the next couple hundred years. And
creating a new American mythology, lest they discover the one that was already here.
right. And so this was when scientism was really born, with the institution of the Smithsonian, because they were more interested in basically keeping down the history than letting it go forward. Perfect example is Michigan, right? So Michigan has tens of thousands of artifacts that they've taken out of these mound sites in Michigan. And the University of Michigan, which is, heavily connected to the Smithsonian, has them all warehoused that you can't go visit, you can't go document, you can't do anything with it. They're just keeping it back there, and they're not going to let anybody actually do any work with it, because, as we know, Michigan is heavily connected to the Bronze Age, right? The Bronze
Yes,
Age.
it is. Lake Michigan copper mines.
Absolutely. So these Lake Michigan copper mines are heavily related to a lot of the copper found in Europe. So how did they get there? You know, what was going on? Did they have massive, supply lines coming from Michigan going all the way into Europe?
Well, we know the Phoenicians were remarkably talented navigators. Is it really as far fetched as some people assume? We've got people who can, sail the Atlantic in homemade boats today.
Yep. Yep. And so the thing that gets me about it is, why weren't they talking about it in Europe? Why wasn't that a bigger topic of discussion of like where'd all this bronze come from? Where are the mines? Somebody had to be doing a damn good job of selling all of that stuff to all the people who wanted to get it so that they could keep the wars going back then without anybody knowing about where it came from. And it seems like the establishment today doesn't want people knowing about it. And going back to the book I got over here, it all goes back to the first century. Like maybe all of these secrets have been passed down through these societies that we just don't know about. Back to
Well,
Ardell again, you know?
yeah, and that's just exactly right, isn't it? I mean, it's not even actually a conspiracy that these secret clubs at the top exist. You're just not a part of it. You don't get the invite, you never hear the name.
Right, right. So the thing that gets me too is I've sort of mapped out in my mind how it could be possible to keep all this stuff under wraps, right? And so stage one is have a trading network using a massive amount of ships and boats, and then stage two would be to round up a bunch of slaves, right? And if you're going to keep this place sort of under wraps, these slaves are entirely disposable. They don't know how to read or write, so they're not going to be telling anybody about it. So you keep these slaves in a constant stream over to the New World, take all that stuff out, and sort of dump the slaves off as you're crossing the Atlantic. So you've got all the copper and none of the people who pulled the copper out. And so as many of these wars that could have happened back then, you grab up the people who you've conquered. You put them on boats. You take them over to the New World. You have them mine a little bit, and then you dump them off when you're done with them.
Or you just leave them, because with prevailing the famous trade winds being what they are, they're not getting back if they never had the navigational skills you did.
Right. And we've got a lot of languages in the New World that are heavily related to a bunch of European languages. You know,
We are totally off topic from Wisconsin and where we start. But,
maybe.
you see things like Chief Joseph Stablin, Chief.
So, who was Chief Joseph?
Gosh, I'd have to get out my Google foo to tell you guys the specifics. But suffice to say that during the Plains Wars, immediately following the Civil War, he was one of the last to surrender. And among the things that changed hands when he finally did so was something that had been a part of his medical bag, or had been kept in his medical bag as a relic. And it contained Mesopotamian cuneiform script.
Wow. So, are we talking about the Mesopotamian handbags?
Mm-hmm.
He had one.
Yes. Specifically, he was a
All right, I'm pulling it up now for the streamers. Let me share my screen. We can get into it a little bit. So it was a Nez Perce. That Great Plains region. I'm not sure where the Nez Perce were.
a little further south of the plains.
Let's see.
Something in my gut wants to tell me that was Oklahoma, even, or maybe New Mexico, but I couldn't tell you for a fact.
Chief Joseph, a recent story I read about the contents of Chief Joseph's medicine bag got me reflecting on medicine bags in general. I've had some personal experience with medicine bags, sported one of my own. So let's see, where is the contents of it? I'm not seeing the contents. But that is incredibly important to world history, and no wonder it's not a big not a big focus. So yeah, I think the connections between the New World and the Old World really do run through a lot of where we're at today. So I don't know if you follow this account on X, but it's the Midwest versus everybody.
I've seen it here and there at least, yeah.
Right, that's one of my favorites. I like to refer to the Midwest as the Holy Land because, in a lot of ways, it really is. And, you know, it seems ironic to be calling the Midwest the Holy Land, but unless we start considering the land that we live on holy, nobody else will, you know? So I think we need to sort of bring back a little bit of that seriousness. Like, this was, like, for instance, Minnesota comes from the word Minigota, and Minigota means the navel of the world, or the Omphalos. And the Omphalos was the center of Greek society. And it's so funny that they would have a similar term for the idea of this is where we were born, this is where we were put. This is our connection to the sky gods. This is our connection to the sky itself. And so, on some level, we have to start taking the land around us as being a little bit more sacred because if not, other people are going to come in here and use it and throw it away like they always have done. So I say that's.
And on that note, I think part of that may just be a generational disconnect. Because when you start talking to the geezers and the old heads and the salt of the earth types in our area, you'll hear them almost universally refer to the region as God's country.
Absolutely.
And I've been known to do it once in a great while myself, depending on who I talk to. But I think there's something to that.
If it's flyover country, who's doing the flying over? Are we talking about East Coasters and West Coasters, or are we talking about the big guy? Right?
That's exactly right, huh?
Absolutely. And on that note, I'd like to end it there. So people, check out Timeline Earth. Check it out. Check out the Scarlet Thread Society, because we got to start pulling on those threads. We got to start getting into our own history. We got to get into our folklore.
Amen. I couldn't have said it better myself, man. Thank you so much for having me on. It was a genuine pleasure to get to talk to you again for the first time in a while. And just on a personal note, maybe you and me can set up some kind of investigation sometime.
Oh, I would love that. I love that. Okay, so there's a graveyard that has these big old wooden carved mushrooms out in front of it. I've never seen a graveyard with big old carved wooden mushrooms out in front of it. And to me, that's an indicator of something going on that's far more ancient than we'd like to realize. It's right in our area too. It's right in this area. I'd love to set something up. Maybe some Saturday go out there and do some filming out there, because I think that we might find something that people aren't paying attention to. Again, they don't look at this as God's country, but we have to.
Yeah, let's. You know what? I'll DM you. We'll get something going, man. Thank you so much.
Absolutely. Thank you for joining me. This has been another Headless Giant podcast. Thank you for being here. Bye, everybody.